Welcome to Conversations That Matter. The objective and mandate of this show is to examine the major issues that are shaping the future of British Columbia. And each week we invite a thought leader to come on and give us their perspective on their area of expertise. Today, once again, we are revisiting land claims. Joining me now is correspondent Mike McNish. Mike, who do we have on the show today?
Stu, we have Professor Linc Kesler. He's a professor in the area of First Nations and Aboriginal Studies at the University of British Columbia. He's also a special advisor to the president of UBC on these matters. He has a very interesting perspective. He's an American Indian by background and history himself, but is certainly well-versed and knowledgeable about the many issues that we're facing up here in British Columbia. What's interesting about Professor Kesler, I think, in particular, is as an expert, he paints a rather optimistic view of the potential for First Nations land title relationships with the provincial, federal government, as well as business. You know, he talks a lot about the concept of understanding the history, the tremendous history of First Nations, and the challenges, of course, we know, of colonialism, and the fact that First Nations still, despite all of that, want very much to make their role in Canada and in a democracy work. And it'll be very interesting, I think, to hear his perspective on the Williams case, because as you know, the Williams case is really stating that land claims are based on the evidence that First Nations can make about their territory going back to pre-contact. That's a long time. And it's going to really change in a remarkable way the way we interact with First Nations, both from the federal government, provincial government, as well as the private sector's perspective. And I'm sure Professor Kesler will have a very unique Indigenous perspective of his own to share.
And he most certainly does. Let's now go to that conversation that we recorded here at La Cigale on August the 18th. First of all, thank you for joining me for this conversation about not just the effects of the Tsilhqot'in decision, but really its place in the greater story, I would say, of people who are of Aboriginal descent living here in British Columbia, and I guess to a larger extent in Canada.
Right.
From your perspective, what does this decision say where we're at as far as Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal Canadian relationships are concerned?
I think this decision is a really important one because it brings a higher level of definition around a couple of central questions that have been left by earlier cases and by the whole progress of Canadian-Aboriginal relations. And in this case, I think the court went further in defining what Aboriginal title means and what meaningful concepts surrounding things like consultation are. One of the things that was very noteworthy about this case was that it was a unanimous decision by the court, so it was a clear recognition, I think, of the legal principles it sets out.
What's interesting in the reaction from a legal perspective and what it means as far as the economic interaction between territories that are still yet to be determined and those that have, is how will this play itself out? And so you get a number of people who work within the business community who go, oh my gosh, it's going to create uncertainty. But
well, I think we've been living with uncertainty for a very long time. We've been living in a dynamic in which that's been very contentious and in which, in many cases, attempts to circumvent process and simply roll over the question of Aboriginal rights has been a long historical tradition. And I think part of what this decision does is to place us on a bit different footing where a much more serious obligation and framework for people engaging in these questions on more equal footing is really to everyone's advantage. And so in that case, I think it's really significant. I mean, we can be, and I'll just one more thought on that score, can begin by noting that the process of rolling over questions of consultation or real regard for Aboriginal interests goes back very early in BC. And by early in our context, I'm talking about 100 years and a bit more. When BC was distinguished as an area by the reluctance of people coming into the area to negotiate treaties with Aboriginal communities. So the fact that there are very few treaties in British Columbia is very much a distinguishing feature of the landscape here. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, came about largely from the reluctance of people coming in to want to negotiate treaties. Mm-hmm. So for 80 years or so, that I think suited people's interests. They felt they could do what they wanted to. But then with a series of court cases in the later 20th century, the absence of treaties really proved to be very significant and to put things on a different footing.
But do you think that we are going through a dynamic shift in the way that we are looking at as Gordon Gibson calls it, a parallel society within Canada, these people who have been removed from the mainstream, put on reservations, and in many cases it was an overt racist, deliberate attempt to obliterate the Indian population in Canada.
Without a doubt.
And that was the zeitgeist of the times. The average person walking down the street probably would have accepted that.
Yep.
We're moving towards recognizing the wrongs of the past, and we're trying to set them right. Mm-hmm. And until we do that, though, court cases on their own won't bring harmony.
I think that's why this is a time of opportunity, and it's an opportunity to do everything we can to try to create a better awareness of not only what the contemporary issues are, but what the history is, how we have arrived at this point, and what has structured the long trains of relationships among different groups. I think there's a really high value in people having a much better context in their understanding to think about our contemporary circumstances and to think about how they want to interact with each other, and to really think about how we would build for ourselves better patterns of interaction that can result in a more just society, but also a much more functional society for everybody who's part of it.
A number of years ago, I listened to a rather interesting interview with former Prime Minister Paul Martin around the time of the Kelowna Accord.
Yes.
And he said, Canadians are very interesting people, generous almost to a fault.
Yeah.
You hear about a village in Africa that has been struck by some disaster.
Right.
We rush to their aid, or Haiti, or so many other places. And yet, they're unaware of what's going on in their own country.
Yeah.
And he was even perplexed to understand why. He didn't, is it willful blindness? Like, what has led us to this point where we almost don't want to believe that it was in the psyche of this country that we call home now that we could have done this?
Yes, and I think I've had occasion to talk with Paul Martin at some length on these kinds of issues, so we've talked about that as well. And I think, it's a very interesting observation. And one of the, I think the difficult thing for people to think about initially, and then once they do, it all makes sense, and it's actually quite liberating, is that extent of blindness is highly structured in the fabric of our society. If you go, and I'll just give you an example which I think is kind of an interesting one. Okay, where I come from in the U.S., where my family comes from, we were the last military resistance to the U.S. cavalry. So, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Red Cloud's War, I mean,
This is your mother's
this is my
traditional
mother's,
territory.
Yeah, this is my mother's traditional family in that social group. And, she grew up near the Wounded Knee, which was the last massacre site. And so all of that history is there. Well, what happened to the leadership of the Tsilhqot'in nation at that point, subsequent to the military defeat, is that many of them chose to join, Wild West shows. So Sitting Bull toured Europe with Buffalo Bill. What's interesting about it is that what the Americans did was they made them icons of American society. So Indians in the United States are part of what makes America America. And that's a very disingenuous circumstance in a lot of ways, because in the U.S. it's still the case that people would rather think about the heroic past than the living present. And in fact, Frank Baum, the writer of The Wizard of Oz, after those military defeats, wrote some pretty inflammatory editorials in a South Dakota newspaper where he was advocating genocide. He said, it's so terrible that these people who were the paragons of a certain form of humanity are now living in such wretched circumstance, and the only humane thing to do is to put them out of their misery, essentially. And interestingly enough, the boarding school movement, and this is another topic, but the boarding school movement in the United States was initially a reply to that sentiment. That, no, it's, the answer is not to kill everybody, the answer is to begin some kind of a process of creating viability. Now, where that went is another issue. In contrast, though, when the group of people, and it was one person in particular, began to work to establish the Calgary Stampede, had a very, very difficult time doing what was routine in the United States, which was incorporating Aboriginal people into the Calgary Stampede ceremonial event structure. There was a ban on the use of ceremonial clothing and on expressions of native culture. So eventually he was successful in having some incorporation of Aboriginal culture in the Calgary Stampede, but it was eventually by negotiating an exception to the Indian Act to do this. And it was for a commercial purpose, essentially. That difference is an indication of what the approach of the government was, which was the suppression of any acknowledgement that there were cultures and that there were people in any meaningful sense. That they became a kind of a blank space in the culture. And as the government moved here into the residential school system, which attempted to segregate Aboriginal children into a school system which was designed to either assimilate them or many of them died there. So the alternative to assimilation was not surviving the school.
Yes, the death rate, astronomical.
Yeah. So as that system was developing, of course that was a very quiet system, as we now recognize as the records from those school systems are becoming more public. A lot of things happened there that very few people knew about. There are a few places now where fairly robust school curriculum is beginning to emerge around Aboriginal history and Aboriginal issues, and certainly around residential schools. But it's really only in a few places that it has a lot of depth. And we're still working on that, for instance, here in British Columbia.
I can't help but feel that we need almost Mandela-like qualities in all communities that are involved here. We fully understand one another. We appreciate the harm that's been done by the other, and say, okay, you hear me, we acknowledge, we're working to heal.
Right.
We're working towards a future where we're together.
Yeah.
But
yes,
and Justice McLaughlin would like to suggest that the Tsilhqot'in decision is another step towards that.
And I think it is in those terms. And I would say a couple of things in response to your idea. One of them is it would be lovely if we had Nelson Mandela's everywhere who could help us work through it. And not saying that Nelson Mandela was not a human with flaws. I'm just saying people who brought that level of insight to situations would be fabulous to have, and we could make a lot of progress with that kind of insight. But I think if Nelson Mandela were to comment on that, I would at least like to imagine that what he would say is it's not so much about looking for individuals to come and provide that level of guidance. What we really need to do is make collective decisions about where we want to go, and not just a direction, but understanding that we will need to build the structures that will allow us to do that. So we certainly in our educational system, we need to be building the structures that will give people the tools and the interpretive context within which to think about the issues. We really need to do that. And then we also need to think about the structure of those things which are perpetuating the circumstances that we're trying to overcome. Mm-hmm. So an example, the apology over the residential schools delivered in Parliament by the Prime Minister. I've talked to two groups of people who were involved in that instance. One of them was the residential school survivors, who really thought there would be some opportunity perhaps to respond to the apology. That didn't happen. They were not invited to do that. Some of the leadership was invited to respond. They were told on their way into the chamber that they would be able to respond. So they were not given the opportunity to frame their remarks ahead of time. They did it on the fly. The last person who spoke was Beverly Jacob. At the time, I was personally very thankful for her remarks, because there were aspects of that ceremony that actually made me quite angry. What she said was, she acknowledged it was a very important moment. She thanked the Prime Minister for having brought the country to the point where something that really needed to happen was accomplished, that this apology had been made. And then she said, in itself, we cannot expect this apology to be a resolution. It does not close a chapter, because the circumstances that people are living with that are the legacy of the residential schools continue. And in many respects, the policies that created the residential schools and the approach to policy that created them are still with us. Mm-hmm. We're living with it to this day. So she charged the Prime Minister to take actions which would advance the circumstances under which the apology would have greater meaning, and address some of the ways in which the structure of the relationship was continuing. Mm-hmm. And I think if you were to ask about whether she thought that had happened or not in the intervening years, she would probably say that very little has happened to do that. This court case is one of the things that may have some of that effect. Chief Justice McLaughlin certainly exerted some real leadership in that respect, but again, I point to the fact that this was a unanimous decision, that she was not alone in that, and I think that's incredibly significant.
Do you see things continuing to get better, that we're going to be able to work together better, that there's going to be a greater level of respect, that there's going to be opportunity for all, or do you think that we've got a rough road to go through?
Well, I think we've got our work cut out for us, and I think it would be foolish to think that it's simply going to get better as a kind of an organic process, an inevitability of history. I think that would be naive. You don't have to do much right to do a whole lot better. Mm-hmm. And if you think about the circumstance of the residential schools and the whole system of expropriation of lands that structured the 19th and 20th century, we're certainly doing better than that now. But there is still a whole lot of unresolved issues to work on, and there's still a real opportunity to continue all of that work and put things on a very different footing. But we will have to do that as a society, have to stop doing some of the things which are really injurious and harmful.
Very harmful to individuals.
Yes.
Who have been robbed of a life where they get to realize their potential,
yeah.
Robbed of the sense of hope.
Right.
I have to tell you, I was out for a ride along with the Vancouver Police Department back in the fall, and we were on the downtown east side.
Mhm.
Got called to 2 different calls and dealt with Aboriginal males who were in distress.
Right.
Both of them. One through alcohol, the other through depression.
Mhm.
And in both cases, and my hat's off to the officers that I was with.
Right.
They had a tremendous amount of compassion. But in both cases, they asked the young men that they were dealing with, like, why are you doing this? And the answer was so heartbreaking. Both said, I'm depressed. I got nothing to hope for.
Mhm.
And if Tsilhqot'in, if the work that others are doing can
Mhm.
start to work its way through Aboriginal communities so that individual people can look at the life that's ahead of them with a greater sense of contribution
Sure.
and purpose, then hopefully they'll live happier lives.
Yeah, and also if they're growing up in communities that do not feel that they're in danger, constantly in danger. I think if you're growing up in that community or with that personal background, it's very hard not to see that continual process of erasure, which is happening in just that, as you read a Canadian history book with no mention of Aboriginal people in it, or if you're in a conversation where people says, someone says, why don't you people just get over that, with no understanding of what that we're supposed to get over even is. It's very hard not to see that, to look up in every street sign and see the die message. It would be better if you weren't here.
Yeah.
And that's a recipe for people. It's not a recipe for mental health if that's the message you're getting from your culture all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that's in our power to change, absolutely. But to do it, it's changing what we're saying, but it also has to be changing what we're doing. It has to be the reality of thinking about the policies and the way in which we go about things, and doing it a different way, not just talking it a different way.
Well, hopefully by talking about it more, to bring it more into the mainstream, we can help to nudge things in the right direction.
I hope so. I mean, that's what I do every day.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for doing this. Appreciate it.